The battlefield had already begun to taste like ash. Smoke lingered in the air like a stubborn fog, clinging to the armor of the few survivors who crawled among the carcasses of their fallen brothers. Each step was heavy, each breath thick with the iron tang of blood and the acrid scent of promethium fires still smoldering. Among the scorched trenchwork and shattered walls, a small, almost imperceptible change began in the flesh of a single soldier. A subtle warmth under the skin that no medici field could explain. A cough rattled from his chest, sharp and dry, yet no one paid it mind at first. War had taught them to ignore the whispers of weakness. The first signs were almost innocent, a scratch that refused to heal, a fever that lingered longer than expected, a faint, salty odor clinging to the hairline. The soldier, Lucian, a guardsman of the 13th Cadian, felt an itch that crawled beneath his scalp, and when he scratched it, he thought he had dislodged some dust or grit. By the next dawn, the itch had spread, a creeping irritation that seemed to burrow into his bones. The medici, busy patching up torn uniforms and cauterizing wounds with searing las cauters, barely noticed. In the silence of the barracks, between the groans of those tending to more obvious injuries, Lucian felt it, the first tendrils of Nurgle's attention. It came without threat. A soft insistence, like a finger tapping on the edge of his mind. "Do not resist," it seemed to whisper. He told himself it was exhaustion, the fever, the smoke, the endless parade of death. And yet, in the night, when he lay shivering beneath a threadbare blanket, the cough returned, wetter this time, leaving him gasping, his chest tight. Something had taken root. The skin around the nails began to thicken, yellowish streaks creeping like ink through parchment. Every movement, every touch, carried a subtle discomfort, a buzzing reminder that his body was no longer entirely his own. Those around him noticed small changes, too. A glance at his fingers, pale and mottled, elicited nervous mutters. The commissar, rigid and unyielding, scowled but said nothing. Discipline demanded stoicism. Lucian, however, could not ignore it. The warmth, the itch, the faint, almost sweet odor clinging to his clothes. It called to him as if promising something he could not name, something beyond pain, beyond fear. And in that call, he found the faintest relief. Each cough left him weak, yes, but also oddly calm. A strange serenity settling over him even as his strength ebbed. By the third day, the first pustules appeared, tiny blisters at first, then swelling, filled with a viscous fluid that gleamed faintly under the dim lighting of the trench. They were disgusting, grotesque in appearance, but Lucian found himself inspecting them with fascination rather than revulsion. He could not remember ever feeling calm like this during a campaign, never so free from the constant gnawing tension of the front lines. The soldiers nearby kept their distance, whispers growing in volume, fear sharpening their eyes. None dared approach him too closely, yet they could not turn away entirely, as if the sickness drew their attention like moths to flame. Sleep, when it came, was restless and vivid. Lucian dreamed of vast gardens where everything pulsed and breathed, where the air itself seemed thick with laughter and decay intertwined. He could hear voices soft and insistent, promising release from the endless grind of war, promising that this discomfort, this fever, was merely the first step toward something greater. He woke sweating, heart pounding, yet feeling an unfamiliar lightness in his chest, as if he had glimpsed something just beyond mortal understanding. In the barracks, his comrades began to avoid him. Orders sounded distant, voices muffled. He noticed the isolation first not as loneliness, but as a strange freedom. Here, in this subtle separation, the infection settled deeper. Lucian could feel it moving under his skin, a living presence that pulsed and throbbed in rhythm with his heartbeat. And though fear would have been natural, he felt none. Only the slow, inevitable acceptance that something larger than himself had noticed, that the Lord of Pestilence had extended a finger and touched him. Resistance was pointless. Understanding was irrelevant. And so the first infection crept along its course, silent, invisible, yet insistent. By the time Lucian stumbled into the medici bay for examination, the gentle touch of corruption had already begun its work. It was the moment when the ordinary soldier began to dissolve, when the line between flesh and disease blurred. and the first whisper of Nurgle's promise wrapped itself around the soul. You will endure, and in your endurance you will find a terrible, unnatural peace. The days that followed were a study in subtlety and erosion. Lucian's body betrayed him in ways that no weapon of war ever had. The pustules spread, snaking along veins, hiding in the folds of skin, swelling in places the eyes could scarcely reach. He tried to hide them beneath uniform gauntlets and sleeves, but the stench betrayed every effort. At first he feared the commissar's wrath, feared the accusations of cowardice. But as the smell became more pronounced, as the thick, sweet rot mingled with the scent of gunpowder and ash, the fear began to dissolve. It was replaced by fascination. He traced the ridges of his swelling skin with fingers that no longer seemed entirely his own, feeling the pulse of life within the decay. Each throb was a confirmation. Something had claimed him, and he had claimed it in return. Interactions with his squad grew strained. Their once jovial banter, the teasing over rations or shared misery, became cautious, hushed. They watched him with suspicion, whispering in the corners, unsure whether to intervene or flee. Lucian could see their thoughts, mirrored in their wary eyes, disgust, fear, perhaps even envy of the calm that now lived in him. He no longer shared their urgency to survive. Their terror felt distant, almost quaint, a relic of the life he once clung to. The sickness did not merely corrode his flesh. It rewrote the cadence of his perception, teaching him to see the battlefield not in terms of victory or loss, but in cycles of endurance, decay, and inevitable transformation. Sleep became a doorway rather than a respite. In the haze between wakefulness and unconsciousness, he saw the garden more clearly, though still as rumor and shadow. Trees of pulsing pustules stretched endlessly, rivers of fetid water reflecting skies that swirled with pale green light. Voices called to him not with malice but with warmth, laughter that sounded like cracking bones, yet soothed his fevered mind. In dreams he walked without fear, unsteady but unbound. He awoke carrying the residue of these visions, a lingering euphoria, a strange pride that his body was becoming something more, something chosen. Yet reality tugged at him relentlessly. The officers demanded reports, the Medicae demanded explanations, and the battlefield continued its indifferent churn. Lucian's reflexes faltered. A twist of the ankle or a stumble over debris left him trembling, not with fear, but with curiosity at the pliancy of his body, the way flesh softened and resisted in unexpected ways. His cough grew wetter, accompanied by sounds that made even the most hardened veterans recoil. And still, beneath it all, a quiet joy persisted, a sense of belonging to a larger, unknowable design. Each gasp, each sigh of discomfort was a hymn, a note in a melody of enduring existence that only he could hear. Whispers spread among the soldiers, tales half-formed and tinged with superstition. Some claimed he was touched by Nurgle himself, a blessing and a curse intertwined. Others feared that the moment they drew too close, the sickness might leap to them, like a shadow leaping across walls. Lucian neither confirmed nor denied. He had long since ceased caring what mortal interpretations might declare. Observation, not judgment, guided him now. The first infection was complete not when the flesh finally yielded, but when the mind began to bend, when instinct gave way to something alien yet intimate, when he no longer asked whether this was sickness or salvation. By the end of the week, Lucian could feel the subtle hum of life and decay mingling in perfect rhythm beneath his skin. The barracks, once crowded and loud with human clamor, now felt hollow, as if the world itself had contracted around him, leaving only the slow, inevitable pulse of corruption. Even the air seemed to thicken when he entered a room, carrying with it the promise and inevitability of change. It was no longer a question of resistance. The first infection had planted its seed, and in its quiet, relentless way, it had begun to bloom. Lucian was no longer simply a man among soldiers. He was an instrument of endurance, a vessel in which rot and life intertwined, and he had learned, perhaps for the first time, the strange serenity of surrender. The line between flesh and infection blurred further as Lucian moved through the remnants of his regiment. Simple tasks became exercises in observation rather than effort. Each twitch of muscle, each pulse of fever, revealed the subtle choreography of Nurgle's hand. He noticed it in the soldiers he passed. The faintest hesitation in a glance, the way some shivered despite no cold, as if sensing the invisible tide of corruption that now flowed through him. No word was spoken, no warning given, only the quiet awareness that the world had subtly shifted, that the first infection was no longer just a personal transformation, but a ripple, extending outward into the lives of all who shared proximity with him. Lucian's body began to betray new capabilities. A twist of his wrist caused small lesions to weep a viscous, almost oily substance, and with it came a faint warmth, a spreading pulse that could not be measured by any medici device. He found he could endure pain that would have felled a lesser man, and even minor wounds healed not with scab or scar, but with soft, unnatural pliancy. The soldiers around him whispered about his endurance, some in fear, some with awe. Yet none dared approach too closely, not fully understanding why they felt both drawn and repelled. The first infection had become a silent teacher, instructing Lucian in the language of decay, the rhythm of endurance, the paradoxical intimacy of disease. Dreams deepened into visions. He saw faces among the rotting trees, not human faces, but reflections of what could be, what might be in a world where mortality was an afterthought. Laughter echoed across the swollen leaves and twisted branches, soft and unsettling, comforting and grotesque in its cadence. Lucian reached out in sleep and woke to find himself instinctively recoiling, then laughing softly at his own hesitation. The infection had already claimed more than his body. It had begun to claim his mind, reshaping thought itself, rewriting instinct into something both alien and intimate. The medici could do nothing. They could cleanse a wound, administer sedatives, or prescribe stimulants to mask fever. But none could touch what had begun within the marrow, the synapses, the subtle pulse beneath the skin. Orders were ignored, discipline became irrelevant, and Lucian moved through the battlefield like a ghost of inevitability, a conduit for the slow expansion of Nurgle's influence. Each step carried subtle decay into the world, each breath whispered of surrender and endurance. Resistance was a memory. Acceptance was the present. By the 10th day, even the fear that had once hovered in the eyes of his comrades began to bend into a different shape. Curiosity edged with fascination. Lucian could see it in their postures, in the hesitant way they handed him rations, in the quick, involuntary glance at his lesions, then away. They did not understand, could not yet comprehend, that the first infection was not mere sickness, but a transformation of perception, a recalibration of what it meant to endure, to persist. In their eyes flickered the faintest recognition that this was no ordinary disease, no mere misfortune. Something larger, older, patient, and eternal had begun its work, and in Lucian it found its first willing pupil. He no longer questioned the presence within, no longer feared the crawling warmth beneath his flesh. He could feel the quiet pulse of Nurgle's attention in each cough, each fevered shiver, each faint odor that trailed in his wake. The first infection was complete not in destruction, but in understanding. The soldier was learning. Through subtle horror and quiet fascination alike, the rhythm of rot, the serenity of surrender, the strange joy of being chosen. In that moment, as he watched the sun rise over a shattered cityscape, Lucian understood, though he could not name it, that nothing would ever be the same. Not for him, not for those who glimpsed him, and perhaps not for the world itself. The transformation deepened with each passing day, no longer subtle, no longer contained. Lucian's body became a vessel for Nurgle's blessings, grotesque and miraculous in equal measure. Pustules and sores swelled along his arms and chest, yet they did not impede him. They pulsed with life, strangely warm, almost sentient. Each lesion seemed to breathe with a rhythm of its own, a heartbeat of decay that mirrored his own. Soldiers whispered that he had become untouchable, immune to the fatigue and wounds that felled others. Where there had once been fear, Lucian now carried a calm authority, an unspoken dominion over the air around him. Even the stench, thick and clinging, became a signal, a perverse herald of Nurgle's favor. It was not merely the body that changed. Lucian's perception of pain had warped into something unrecognizable. What would have once driven him to cry out or collapse now inspired a quiet fascination. A blade that tore through cloth and skin was met with detached curiosity, a fleeting moment of discomfort followed by an almost euphoric pulse. Infection spread faster through him than any wound, as if the rot itself sought his blessing, flowing along his veins and teaching him the language of decay. In every shiver, every fever, he felt communion with something vast, patient, eternal. Each cough, each blister, each subtle rupture in his skin was a gift, a token of belonging to a larger design beyond mortal understanding. Among the soldiers of the regiment, responses varied between horror and awe. Some kept their distance, muttering prayers to the Emperor, hands clasped over weapons as if the holiest of rites might shield them from the contagion. Others watched with fascination, unable to turn away from the grotesque display of power and endurance. Lucian no longer required explanation, for he understood without words. Nurgle's blessings were both liberation and imprisonment, freedom and inevitability intertwined. He could feel the subtle pull of the plague god's intent in every droplet of pus that formed on his skin, in every bead of sweat that carried a faint scent of rot. The gifts were not given lightly, and the joy they brought was inseparable from the horror that birthed it. In the barracks and battlefield alike, he became a walking testament to this paradox. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones of the way wounds closed almost immediately, leaving soft, unnatural tissue that glimmered faintly in the dim light. Others noticed the quiet laughter that escaped him, soft and wet, echoing like distant voices through the corridors. It was not mockery nor madness, but something older, a joy rooted in endurance, in the eternal dance of decay and renewal. Lucian moved among them with an otherworldly calm, radiating the confidence that came from knowing the rot could touch him, but could not undo him. The gifts of Nurgle were a covenant, and he had become their willing steward. Even the mundane became strange and potent. A drop of contaminated water seemed to hum with vitality. A patch of mold in the corner of the barracks became almost sacred, a microcosm of the garden that lurked in rumor and vision. Lucian's touch carried subtle changes. A fellow soldier's fever abated slightly after contact, only to flare later in a rhythm that mirrored Lucian's own body. It was teaching him, instructing him in the ways of contagion, the interplay of disease and vitality, decay and joy. Through this communion, he began to understand a truth whispered in fevered dream. Nurgle's gifts were not merely afflictions. They were a doorway into a state of being beyond fear, beyond pain, beyond mortality. Yet with each gift came the undeniable weight of reality. The regiment, already thinned by battle, now kept him at arm's length. Rumors flourished, as did fear, and whispers of curses traveled down the corridors and through the ranks. Nurgle's blessings were intoxicating, but they were visible, tangible, undeniable. Those who approached too closely were confronted not with violence, but with the subtle, inexorable insistence of corruption. A gentle itch under the skin, a warmth that spread faster than comprehension. Even now, some whispered, there was still a choice. Yet as Lucian's body pulsed and breathed with life drawn from decay, the truth became clear. Once touched by Nurgle, the choice was not whether to change, but when to surrender. The battlefield itself seemed to acknowledge his presence. The air thickened, and the cries of the wounded and dying took on a strange cadence, as if echoing the rhythm of the first infection. Pustules, sores, and swelling were no longer signs of weakness. They were badges of survival, markers of a soul in communion with the eternal. And as Lucian trudged forward, limbs heavy with life and rot, he felt the first flickers of joy deepen into something more profound, more serene. Nurgle's gifts were not merely curses. They were a form of understanding, a revelation wrapped in the grotesque. In the quiet, in the laughter of sores and swelling, Lucian began to see what it meant to be truly chosen. The weeks passed, and Lucian's transformation accelerated, no longer confined to the subtle whispers of early infection. His body had become a map of Nurgle's will, swollen and mottled, each pustule a testament to the plague god's intricate design. He moved through the battlefield with a confidence born of inevitability. Bullets and blades glanced off hardened skin, while minor wounds healed in moments, leaving behind tissue that pulsed faintly as if alive with its own heartbeat. The soldiers around him began to treat him differently, not with hostility, but with a mix of awe and dread. He was no longer merely one of them. He had become an exemplar of endurance, a living vector of corruption that none could ignore. This was the true nature of Nurgle's gifts. They did not merely afflict, they reshaped, elevated, and bound. Lucian discovered abilities he had never imagined. He could remain conscious through injuries that would have felled others, endure fevered delirium without losing clarity, and even sense the presence of disease in others, a subtle warmth under the skin, or a faint odor carried on the wind. He began to experiment in small ways, touching a wounded comrade or contaminated surface, and feeling the ebb and flow of vitality and decay, as if the world itself were a vast organism and he a conduit through which it spoke. Yet the blessings were not without cost. Sleep became fragmented, dreams more vivid and intrusive as the Garden of Nurgle grew more real in his mind. He wandered through visions of endless rot, rivers of pus feeding forests of swollen limbs, skies heavy with green light that refracted off decaying leaves. The laughter of unseen entities echoed through the visions, wet and crackling, both horrifying and soothing. Lucian awoke sweating, heart pounding, yet imbued with a strange serenity, a deepened understanding of the delicate balance between life and decay. The corruption had begun to touch not only his flesh, but his mind, reshaping perception, softening resistance, and heightening senses beyond mortal norms. The regiment, meanwhile, adapted to his new presence with caution. Some kept their distance, muttering prayers to the Emperor. Others simply averted their gaze, fascinated yet terrified by the spectacle. Lucian noticed these reactions without judgment, understanding that fear and awe were both natural responses to forces beyond comprehension. The gifts of Nurgle were both blessing and burden, offering endurance and clarity at the cost of alienation and subtle, relentless change. Each interaction became a lesson, teaching him the rhythms of contagion, the patterns of suffering, and the strange joy of survival within decay. Even in the midst of battle, Lucian became a pivot around which events unfolded differently. Minor skirmishes ended without his bloodshed, the sick and wounded drawn subtly toward him, healed or changed by his mere presence. He could feel the pull of Nurgle in every cough, every shiver, every trembling hand that reached for aid. The world, once harsh and unforgiving, seemed to bend around him, acknowledging the slow, patient work of the plague god. Lucian understood now that his survival was not an anomaly, but a deliberate extension of Nurgle's will. Every gift he received, every lesion, every pulse of warmth beneath the skin was a note in a symphony of endurance composed by the Lord of Decay. By the end of the second month, the distinction between human and vector had blurred. Lucian no longer saw himself as a man merely surviving war. He was a vessel, a teacher, a herald of Nurgle's patience. The grotesque transformations that terrified others had become natural to him, integrated into his identity, reshaping instinct and perception alike. And in the quiet moments between battles, when fever and fatigue ebbed, he felt the soft, unwavering presence of something vast and eternal, the silent whisper of the garden, reminding him that every swell, every cough, every pulse was a gift, a promise that endurance was not merely survival, but communion. And so the gifts deepened, carrying him inevitably forward. The first whispers of infection had become the chorus of transformation. Lucian was no longer alone in his change. He was part of a pattern, a slow, deliberate weaving of life and rot, decay and joy. Nurgle's blessings were not a choice. They were inevitability incarnate. And in their embrace he found a serenity that no battlefield could disrupt, a clarity that no mortal fear could touch. He was no longer just Lucian of the 13th Cadian. He was the first witness to the joyful, terrible, eternal rhythm of the plague god's design. The boundary between life and death became meaningless. Lucian felt it first in moments of stillness, when the world's chaos slowed to a murmur and the pulse of rot within him harmonized with his own heartbeat. Wounds that should have ended him remained open, soft, oozing, yet never fatal. Fevered delirium carried him not into despair but into clarity, a perception of the world as a living organism of endless cycles. Death, once an absolute, had become a door rather than a terminus, a mere pause before the next cadence of decay and renewal. He understood now what Nurgle's true gift was, not survival alone, but transformation. An unbroken chain linking agony to joy, flesh to spirit, mortality to eternity. The soldiers around him began to take note of changes far beyond the physical. Lucian's laughter, once wet and hesitant, now carried a resonance that unsettled even the hardest veterans. It echoed in the corridors of trenches, mingled with the whispers of the dying, and seemed to ripple through the air itself. Those who stared too long could feel it crawling along their nerves, a subtle insistence that the world was shifting, that decay and life were no longer adversaries but intertwined forces. They avoided him when possible, yet curiosity bound them, their eyes drawn to the subtle glory of a man unbroken, unafraid and yet reshaped utterly by corruption. In dreams, he walked through endless corridors of flesh and fungus, where every step left a mark of bloom and rot. Limbs that should have been dead twitched with vitality, bodies decomposed and reborn in patterns that mirrored the slow pulse within him. And always, the laughter, the soft, wet, gleaming laughter of beings too vast to comprehend, echoed from places unseen. He reached out, touching the walls, the floors, the rivers of ichor, and each contact sent warmth crawling along his veins. When he awoke, his body bore the echo of those visions. Minor sores blossomed overnight, small pustules leaking faintly, a rhythm that he began to recognize as the heartbeat of something eternal. Combat itself became a laboratory of revelation. Wounds that would have been fatal to other soldiers left him strangely invigorated. The pain became a note in a larger symphony, a harmony of suffering and endurance. Each time he bled, he felt the pulse of Nurgle in the air, a gentle insistence that nothing was final, that every tear in flesh or spirit was merely an opening into the next phase of transformation. The battlefield, chaotic and cruel, became a conduit, a mirror of the processes unfolding within him. Death, when it appeared around him, was no longer a threat but a signal. Life and decay were inseparable, each defining the other in infinite, patient loops. As the weeks turned into months, Lucian found the final vestiges of his former identity slipping away. Names, faces, loyalties, these became secondary to the rhythms of infection, to the pulse of rot and vitality that now defined every thought, every breath. And yet, paradoxically, he felt no loss, only expansion. He could sense the cycles of those around him, the sick, the wounded, the dying, and, through touch, subtle presence, and whispered influence, he could extend the same strange, terrible mercy that had claimed him. To die was no longer a release, but a transformation. To live was to endure, yes, but also to carry forward the song of decay into every corner of reality that one could reach. The soldiers who survived alongside him began to speak in hushed tones of the miracle and horror he embodied. Some prayed, some averted their gaze, some touched him surreptitiously, seeking relief from fever or fatigue, only to feel a subtle tug, a warmth that promised change and recoiled with both fear and fascination. Lucian could not stop it, nor would he have tried. The process was complete. The first infection had become a communion, the gifts of Nurgle no longer subtle, no longer optional. Every step he took, every cough, every pulse of warmth beneath the skin spread understanding and transformation alike. Death had ceased to be a boundary. It had become a rhythm, and he danced to it effortlessly, a participant in cycles both grotesque and beautiful. By the end of this phase, Lucian was unrecognizable not merely in body, but in essence. He was a herald, a conduit, a living testament to the terrifying serenity of Nurgle's will. Pain and decay had become joy. Mortality had become fluid. The line between the man he had been and the vessel he now inhabited had dissolved, and somewhere in the softest, most persistent corners of perception, he felt the first whisper of the garden itself, vast, eternal, and waiting, a place where the cycles of suffering and endurance, of death and rebirth, would continue forever. Lucian did not walk into the garden. It walked into him. The visions had grown insistent, weaving themselves into waking thought so completely that he could no longer distinguish between the battlefield and the bloated paradise of Nurgle's making. Every rusting wall, every puddle of stagnant water, became a mirror of that realm, soft green light refracted in the grime, fungi pulsing as if with heartbeat and the sweet, nauseating stench of rot thickening the air. He could feel it calling, the subtle tug of inevitability in every breath, promising a surrender unlike any he had known, an intimacy with decay and endurance that surpassed survival. The garden was a paradox of horror and serenity. Rivers of fetid water wound through trees swollen with blossoms of pustules. And yet there was rhythm to it, a pattern in the grotesque proliferation. Every bloom, every twitching limb was alive in a way that inspired both revulsion and awe. Lucian walked among these visions, not as a stranger, but as one already acknowledged. The soft laughter, wet and resonant, echoed around him, carrying knowledge and memory older than Terra itself. It whispered of eternity in cycles, of life and death as indistinguishable partners in an infinite dance. And with every breath he drew, he felt his own pulse sinking to that rhythm, his body both vessel and instrument of the garden's slow, deliberate song. The soldiers who remained with him saw only glimpses. Occasionally, his eyes would glaze for a fraction of a second, his posture shifting as if the world itself had tilted. They whispered rumors of what he saw, fearful that the corruption had not merely touched his flesh, but bent his soul toward realms they could never hope to comprehend. Some fled the proximity of his presence. Some prayed aloud, trembling before the subtle authority that Lucian now radiated. But he did not notice their fear. The garden's embrace was complete. Their perception was inconsequential. He was no longer merely a man, nor merely a servant of the battlefield. He was a conduit, a bridge between the mortal plane and a realm of rot and eternity that existed in rumor, in vision, and in whispered worship. Even the environment seemed to recognize his connection. Grass that should have withered under promethium fire retained a sickly green sheen. Puddles carried hints of color, faint iridescence under the dim light. Even the carrion of the battlefield seemed to pulse faintly when he passed. Lucian touched a bloated corpse and felt the subtle thrum of life beneath its decay, a rhythm mirrored in his own veins. The garden did not merely manifest in dreams or visions, it threaded through reality, and Lucian, by virtue of his transformation, had become its lens, bringing the terrible and beautiful into contact with the living. The laughter of Nurgle's creatures followed him, not with mockery, but with recognition. The grotesque inhabitants of the garden, malformed and swollen, yet undeniably sentient, observed him with what he felt as curiosity and respect. He reached out instinctively, touching the putrid bark of a pulsating tree, and the warmth ran through him like a second heartbeat. He felt no fear, only connection. An understanding that the garden was a place not of punishment, but of communion, a realm where decay was sacred, where disease and endurance were inseparable, and where joy could be born from the grotesque. Rumors whispered through the minds of the uncorrupted. Those who glimpsed the effects on Lucian spoke of a place where men were neither alive nor dead, where the air itself was heavy with the scent of eternity, and where the plague god's children laughed with the serenity of the eternally patient. Yet he understood the truth of their words only partially. The garden was not a place to be visited. It was a force, a presence, a truth that wrapped itself around the willing, pulling the soul into its rhythm, its cycles, its patterns. Lucian had already been claimed. His body, his mind, even his awareness had become instruments of its beauty and horror, its cycles and eternity. By the time he raised his eyes from the battlefield, the horizon seemed to shimmer faintly, as if the veil between reality and vision had thinned. He understood without words that the garden was no longer distant. It lived in every pustule, every pulse of warmth, every sigh and cough that carried the breath of life mingled with decay. Lucian's surrender had become a bridge, a quiet channeling of Nurgle's will into the world of mortals. The garden's embrace was complete, and in it, he discovered a serenity both terrifying and intoxicating. The knowledge that decay was not an end, but a continuation, a pattern of eternal persistence in which he would walk forever. The world no longer mattered in the same way. Cities burned, stars blinked in distant voids, armies clashed, and yet Lucian felt only the slow, unrelenting rhythm of decay and endurance coursing through him. The garden's presence pulsed faintly in every breath, every heartbeat, every whisper of rot that lingered on his skin. Mortality, once a cage, had dissolved into a pattern, a series of cycles that stretched far beyond comprehension. Lucian understood, at last, that he was no longer merely a man, nor even a vessel. He was a node in a vast eternal network, a living instrument of the plague god's design. The gifts that had first arrived as subtle infections had culminated in something greater. His skin glistened with sores that pulsed softly, a living map of rot and vitality. Limbs bore the subtle swelling of growths, both obscene and wondrous, each movement a study in the coexistence of decay and function. He could endure blows that would fell even the strongest of uninfected warriors, and yet he moved with the grace of someone intimately familiar with the ebb and flow of life and death. Pain, injury, fatigue, these were no longer threats but guides, rhythms to which he attuned himself as naturally as breathing. Time itself became fluid. Days and nights blurred into one another, marked not by sunlight or standard cadence, but by the pulse of rot within him. Corpses and battlefields, once horrifying reminders of mortality, now resonated with quiet purpose. Each fallen soldier, each wounded companion, was another note in the symphony of decay, another echo of Nurgle's patience and eternity. Lucian walked among them without fear, understanding the cycles that bound them all, seeing the harmony where others saw only chaos. Death, the final enemy of man, had become a teacher, guiding each soul through transformation and renewal in ways only Nurgle could orchestrate. The whispers of the garden were constant companions, no longer confined to dreams or visions. The bloated laughter, the subtle warmth in pustules, the rhythmic pulse beneath his skin, all reminded him that eternity was not punishment nor reward, but a state of being. He sensed others' fear, awe, and curiosity, yet it no longer mattered. The uncorrupted might label him abomination, demon, or saint, but these names were irrelevant to someone who had moved beyond mortal perception. Lucian's existence had become an embodiment of the paradox Nurgle offered: joy in suffering, endurance through decay, serenity within corruption. Through these cycles, Lucian began to sense the broader implications of his transformation. The whispers spoke of contagion, not as destruction but as integration, an endless extension of the garden into the mortal plane. Every cough, every lesion, every pulse of warmth was a message, a bridge from the world of flesh and bone to the infinite embrace of rot and patience. Those who succumbed became not victims, but participants in the eternal rhythm, joining a choir whose song was carried through time itself. Lucian understood, with a clarity sharpened by fever and corruption, that eternity was not solitary. It was communal, grotesque, and beautiful. Each soul added depth to the garden, a living testament to Nurgle's deliberate, unending design. And yet, even in the midst of this grotesque communion, Lucian retained a fragile sense of self. He remembered the battlefield, the regiment, the fleeting moments of fear and camaraderie. These memories were no longer anchors, but threads woven into the vast tapestry of decay, reminders that transformation was not annihilation, but synthesis. His mind, reshaped by fever, visions, and the gentle insistence of Nurgle's touch, could perceive the delicate interplay of mortality and eternity in ways few could comprehend. Every moment of pain, every twitch of a pustule, every breath of rot was a revelation, Life and decay, suffering and joy were inseparable, and in their union lay the truth of existence beyond death. By the time he paused on a scorched hilltop overlooking the battlefield, Lucian felt the full weight and liberation of his existence. He was unbroken, unyielding, and utterly changed. The garden flowed through him and threw him into the world, a slow, deliberate expansion of eternity. The plague. God's blessings were complete, their gifts no longer subtle or temporary, but permanent, woven into every pulse of his being. And in that permanence, Lucian understood what it truly meant to live forever in decay, to endure endlessly, to witness the cycles of life and death, to find joy and serenity in the rot, and to know, with unwavering certainty, that Nurgle's hand had claimed him, and that claim would never end.